Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf known as test begins with the Gemara's initial comments on a Mishnah which we had just seen, the final Mishnah on the subject of measuring the borders of cities and their tchumin. Then we get a new Mishnah which introduces us to the lachas of shitufim mavos, combining an entire city into one large eruv, one large combined equivalent of an eruv chatzeres for everything in the city. And we're going to discuss when you have to leave part of the city out of the eruv, out of the shitufim mavos, and when you're allowed to include the entire city altogether. So first of all, we had seen in the last Mishnah that if you measured the borders of a city and the tchumin of the city, and in one place it comes out longer, one place it comes out shorter, you're allowed to go up until the longer measure. So the Gemara says up until the longer measure, but not until the shorter measure. That doesn't make sense. If you can go to the longer measure, you can certainly go to the shorter measure. The Gemara says, yeah, that's what the Mishnah means. You can even go to the longer measure, not only to the longer measure. Now, the Mishnah had said it twice, so the Gemara wants to know, why do you have to say the same halacha twice? And the Gemara says, no, one was referring to where there was two measures, one longer and one shorter, and one was referring to where two people made measurements, and one made a longer measure, one made a shorter measure. You're allowed to go with the longer measure. You could assume that the shorter one made the mistake, as long as it's logical. What does that mean? As long as the mistake could be explained by the fact that he didn't stretch the rope far enough, or that when he was calculating the corners, he calculated 2,000 amos from the corner of the city's border to the corner of the tchum, which is not correct. It's not supposed to be 2,000 amos. It's supposed to be longer than that. It's supposed to be an extra 800 amos. So if he didn't measure that, if we could explain why one is shorter and one is longer by that mistake, then we would go with the longer one. If, however, the longer one is so much further that there isn't any really valid explanation for why his came out longer and the other one came out shorter, then we would have to investigate. We couldn't just use the longer one. Now, the Mishnah had finished off and said that the rules of Eruvin are always l'kula because they're rabbanan. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? We have a different brisa that says that the rules of Eruvin, Eruvei tchumin, are a chumrah. There are stringencies. So the Gemara says, yeah, there is stringency over the rules of the Torah. The Torah doesn't have rules of tchumin. Therefore, they're more strict than the Torah's actual rules are. But they were made to be lenient. They were made with built-in leniencies, and therefore you're always allowed to go l'kula whenever you have a question such as which is the correct measure when there are conflicting measures. Okay, this takes us to the end of this Gemara. Well, now we're about to start the new Mishnah, which is discussing the halachas of shitufim mavos. Now, shitufim mavos are just like eruv chatzeres. That's where if you have a number of mavos, a number of alleys or streets within a city, in order for people to be able to carry from one to the other, or from courtyards that open into the alleys, you have to have a shituf. You have to have a combination. Again, the logic of shitufim mavos and eruv chatzeres is that Chazal said it's forbidden for people who it's forbidden for a region in which multiple people have rights to walk. It's forbidden to carry there because there are multiple owners. You have to make one owner, and the way you do that is by combining all the people who have the rights to use it into one conglomerate, and that conglomerate now owns the actual city itself, or it owns the streets itself, or owns the yards itself, whatever it is that you're combining into one. Now, when you have a number of different yards opening into one mavo, into one alley, so you got to combine all the people who have the rights to use the alley. If you have a number of different alleys within one city, you could also combine the various alleys and their owners and those who have rights to use it in the city all into one. But as we shall see, that might be limited. If you have a Rishus Harabim, according to most opinions, you cannot carry a Rishus Harabim even if you make an eruv of any sort. You also, if there's a city that has a halacha of a rabbim, you shouldn't make one very large shitufim mavos, because what ends up happening is that everybody forgets that there's a problem, there's a need for a shitufim mavos, and that there is one. What's the point of shitufim mavos? The point of it is that people should keep in mind that you cannot just carry a Rishus Harabim. When you have a number of different mavos opening to each other, or chatzeros opening into mavos, it looks like smaller private areas opening into Rishus Harabim. People will get confused. So we want to remember the fact that there is a Isser. There is a thing called Rishus Harabim, and that you're not allowed to carry from a private area into Rishus Harabim. if we'll just have an automatic shetufim mevais, nobody's going to know about it. We're not even going to remember that. It won't serve the purpose. And therefore, if you have a very large city, you have to leave part of the areas out of the shetufim mevais. You would not be able to carry in those areas. And then you would keep in mind, the only reason I'm allowed to carry where I am allowed to carry is because there's a shetufim mevais, and I'll remember the concept of shetufim mevais, and I'll remember the concept of Rishus Harabim in the first place. So the Mishnah begins by telling us what type of city does this halacha apply to, and Mishnah says this applies to a city which was always a large city that has a rabbim in it. It has 600,000 people in it, and it has Rishus Harabim in it. Even if at some point the city shrunk and now it doesn't have it, you still have to keep this halacha because it may grow again. And therefore you have to leave something out of the shetufim mevais. How much do you have to leave out? Machlokes, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be a area the size of a city called Chadasha in a region called Yehuda, which had at least 50 residents. With Rabbi Shimon, you just have to leave 3 courtyards, each of which have 2 homes, for a total of 6 homes. That's all a city that began as a city of Rabbim. That means that it's a large city with 600,000 residents in it, with marketplaces, with whatever you need. However, if you have a city which was originally a privately owned, small private city, did not have that many people in it, and then at some point it grew, and now it became a Rabbim, so even though now it has a Rabbim, it still has the halach of a small city, and you don't have to leave a piece of the city out of the Shetufim Mevais. So the Gemara begins here. The Gemara says, what's an example of a city like that? So the Gemara first says, the city of the Reish Galusa, the Iskarta of the Reish Galusa. He was the local exilarch. He was the governor of the Jewish community. So the Gemara says, why do you choose that as an example? Is it because a lot of people come there all the time to talk to him because they need him for things, and therefore they'll remind each other of this halacha, they'll remind each other that you're only allowed to carry here because there's a shetufei mevais, and therefore they'll remember the halacha of Rishus Harabim. But in other cities which you don't have a lot of people there, you wouldn't remember this halacha, and therefore we wouldn't allow you to make an eruv for the entire city together. And where says that can be, because every regular Jewish city, people always meet. Shabbos morning, they go to shul, they meet each other, and therefore they'll have a chance to remind each other of this halacha. So the Gemara really changes. The Gemara says it doesn't have to be the city of the Reish Galusa. It gives an example of a city that was owned by a fellow named Nitozai, and he had a small city which then grew, and this qualifies for this example. Now the Gemara brings a brisa which has a number of halachos in it relative to this discussion, and the Gemara is going to analyze these halachos one by one. So first of all, the brisa says if you have a Rishus Harabim running through a city, you can make an eruv in the Rishus Harabim, according to this opinion. The way you do it is you put a lechi on either end of the Rishus Harabim, or you put a crossbeam on either end of Rishus Harabim, and that's enough. That's halacha number 1, which the Gemara will analyze. The next halacha the Gemara says is that you cannot include half of a city in a shetufei mevais. Obviously, we're referring to a city which you are meant to include the entire city together. And if you are meant to include the whole city, you can't include half the city in and half the city out. Then that becomes a halacha where you have part of the people joining a shita for an eruv and part of the people not joining. The halacha there is that those who aren't joining ruin it for those who are joining. It's a partially joined eruv, and the eruv is now not owned by one conglomerate. It's owned by one conglomerate plus a bunch of others who didn't join the conglomerate. That would make the entire thing forbidden because it's multiple people owning it. It's not owned by one person. The next halacha it says is that, however, you could have each mavoi on its own make its own eruv. Its own shetufei mevais. You don't have to join them all together. The Gemara will ask, how could you do that? We should have the same problem. And the last halacha in this brisa is that if you have only one entrance to this Rishus Harabim, meaning the city has a wall around it, and the wall has only one door, so there's only the Rishus Harabim of the city doesn't pass through in on one end and out on the other end. It has only one entrance, then you are allowed to make an eruv for the entire city. That is not considered to be a Rishus Harabim. Okay, now the Gemara analyzes the halachas of this brisa one at a time. First of all, this brisa had claimed that you're allowed to actually make an eruv over Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara says, who holds that way? The Gemara says, this is Rabbi Yehuda. It's an old machlokes that we've seen. Somebody who has two houses across the street from each other. So you have two walls across the Rosh Hashanah. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, you could actually make an eruv by just making rudimentary third and fourth walls. Either you put a lechi on each end, on each end of your house walls on both sides, so that you have lechis serving as the third and fourth walls, or you put a beam running across your house from corner to corner across the street on each end, so that you have beams serving as your fourth walls. The Chacham said, no, you can't make an eruv over Rosh Hashanah like that, and therefore you see Rabbi Yehuda says you are allowed to make an eruv over Rosh Hashanah, and that would be that opinion. Okay, the next halacha that we had seen is that you cannot divide the city in half. That means you can't have half the city joining the Shetufei Mavos and half the city not joining the Shetufei Mavos. So now the Gemara says that Rav Papa says it makes a difference which half of the city we're referring to. How are we dividing the city in half? Now, the way the cities looked was that they had one main street which ran across the center of the city. That was Rosh Hashanah, and usually there were two entrances to the city, one on either end of Rosh Hashanah. So you had, let's say, a door to the city on the east end and a door to the west end, and the street ran east to west from door to door. So the city was divided into a north half and a south half by the east-west running street right across the middle. So Rav Papa says that if you're going to divide the city in half along the main street, east-west, so that you'll have the northern half and the southern half, that'll for sure not be good, because the north half and the south half are both going to use the same Rosh Hashanah, and therefore they're both overlapping. They're both using the same central street. You're dividing it along that street, but they will both end up using that street. And if you can have one half that has a Shetufei Mavos, one half does not, you left them out, and they're still going to use it, and that messes up your Shetufei Mavos, because there are people using those common areas that are not included in that Shituf. If, however, you do it differently, you divide it vertically, you divide it in a division line that runs perpendicular to the main street, to the Rosh Hashanah, so that you have, let's say, the eastern half has a Shetufei Mavos and the western half does not. So now it's not really such a problem, because the western half, which doesn't have part of the Shetufei Mavos, will only use the western door. They'll go out of the western door of the city, and they don't really have to walk through any part of the eastern half that has the Shetufei Mavos. So the Gemara has two versions of what Rav Papa said exactly. According to the first version, he said that this would be okay if you divide it perpendicular to the main street. According to the second version, it's also a problem dividing it that way. That wouldn't help. Now, the Gemara compares this to a different machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, and the Gemara, according to each version, each version would line up according to one of those opinions, and then the Gemara says that actually neither of them line up. It's not dependent on each other at all. What's this other machlokes? So Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim have a machlokes about two courtyards, one which is within the other. That means that one opens to Rosh Hashanah, and the other one is behind it, and it doesn't have any opening to anywhere except into the first chutzner, and it has to go through that chutzner to get to Rosh Hashanah. Now, what happened? So, if nobody, the outer chutzner that opens to Rosh Hashanah had all the houses that open into that chutzner made a eruv chatzeris. The inner chutzner, however, did not join that eruv chatzeris. The question: does that mess up the eruv chatzeris of the outer people? Because those inner people also need to walk through that chutzner to get to Rosh Hashanah. They have a right to walk through there, and they're not part of the eruv, so the eruv is not complete. They didn't join that eruv chatzeris, so maybe it will mess it up. So the Gemara says as follows: everybody agrees, Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva, that if the inner people didn't make any eruv chatzeris at all, they don't even have their own eruv chatzeris, that they mess up the outer eruv chatzeris because they have the right to walk through and they didn't join it. Where's their machlokes? Machlokes is if the inner people made their own eruv chatzeris for their own courtyard and they didn't join the outer courtyard. So in this case, the outer people could tell them, look, stay in your courtyard. You have a right to walk around in your yard. Don't pass through our outer one. Don't mess up our outer one. You don't have a right to say, well, I'm allowed to walk through your outer yard, and therefore your outer yard is no good. You have a place you could walk. You could walk through the inner one. So that's the machlokas Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Rabbi Akiva says the inner chutzner still makes the outer chutzner's erev no good. It still answers it because they still have a right to walk through. The Chachamim say, no, the outer people have a right to tell them stay in your chutzner, don't answer my chutzner. So now, Rav Papa's halacha seems to be dependent on this, depending which version of Rav Papa you hold like. If he said that you can divide the city perpendicular to the yard, so then that means to say that the fact that the other people can walk through on this half of the city is not a problem, because we tell them don't walk on this half, walk on the other half and go out the other doorway. That would seem to fit with the opinion of the Chachamim. According to the other version where he said that you can't do that, that would seem to fit with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that it would be forbidden because you can't tell them walk out the other doorway to the city, and they will also have the rights to walk through this doorway to the city, and therefore it's forbidden. So the Gemara says it's not necessarily these two machlokim don't line up at all. Rabbi Akiva, who says that it's forbidden, that's because the people in the inner chutzner can't get out to Rosh Hashanah any other way. They're stuck. The only way that they could get to Rosh Hashanah is through the outer yard. So the outer yard people can't tell them stay in your yard. They have to be able to get through. However, in the case of the city, there's a doorway on each end of the city. And there's no reason why the people from one side should have to go out the door on the opposite side. They could go through their own door. Now the other way as well, the Chachamim, in the case of the yards, they could tell the inner people stay inside. You don't have a right to go out through the outer chutzner now. That's because there's a clear demarcation. There's two separate chutzneros. They could say, stay in yours. Well, lock the door between the two. You have no right to come through here, and therefore you don't have a right on Shabbos to go through the outer yard, and therefore you don't mess up the Erev Chatzeros by not joining it. However, in the case of Rosh Hashanah, this is a whole Rosh Hashanah. You're not going to be able to close off half of it to half the city. People are going to end up walking, and therefore they are going to be using it, and it would be forbidden for them to walk through. You cannot say, well, you could walk out through your door on your end. Now, the next halacha we had seen in the Brisa was that the mavois are allowed to do their own chatzeros. They are allowed to have their own shitufei mavois. So the Gemara says, why isn't it a problem that other people could walk into their mavoi and they weren't included? So the Gemara says, we're referring to where they made some kind of symbol at the entrance to the mavoi. They made like a low doorway that shows that it's closed off, and this mavoi has its own shituf, and other people shouldn't be walking through here, and they're not planning on walking out of here into anybody else's mavoi either. Okay. The last halacha we had seen was that if it has only one doorway, it's okay. If the entire city has only one doorway, it's okay. You can include the entire city in one shituf. You don't have to leave anything over outside the shituf. So the Gemara brings in here that Rabbi Zera made an Erev Chatzeros or Shetufei Mavos for the city of Rabbi Chia, Chi's yeshiva, and he didn't leave over any houses outside it. So Gemara Abaye asked him, how could you do that? Don't you know the halacha that you have to leave something outside the city? This was always the city shel Rabbim. So he said, well, there's old people in the city, and they told me that in the days of Rabbi Chia, they made one Erev Chatzeros, one Shitufei Mavos for the entire city. So I assume that means that this was once a city of Yechidim. It was once not a Rabbim city, and therefore it doesn't require anything to be left over on the side. So Abaye said to him, well, I spoke to those old men also, and it's not the pshat. They said it was always a Rabbim city. The only reason why there was some time in history at which they didn't leave any houses outside the Shetufei Mavos was because at that time there was a garbage heap piled right outside one of the doorways of the city. And therefore it was like a city with only one doorway. During that time it was closed off, and that's why they were allowed to include every part, all the houses in the Shetufei Mavos. Now, however, that garbage is gone, there are two doorways, so you don't have that halacha. So Rabbi Zera said, I was not aware that was the pshat. I thought that it was a city of Rabbim, but thank you, now you are correct. Gemara asks, what happens if you only have one doorway to the city on one end of the Rosh Hashanah, but on the other end there's a ladder, and the ladder goes over the wall of the city, so it kind of functions as a doorway, but kind of not. So what does that count as? So Gemara says that Ravi Ami Barado Harpano asked this question from Rabbah, And he quoted Rav, and he said that it counts as a door. It's a city with two doorways. And Rav Nachman said, don't listen to that. Rav Ada said Rav other ways. He said that a ladder over a wall does not count as a doorway. It counts as a doorway, and it counts as a wall concerning different halachas. It counts as a wall concerning this, that is considered wall. This is a city with only one doorway. It only counts as a doorway Legabe a different halacha, and that's if you have a ladder between two chatzeros, over the wall between the two chatzeros, so the people in the two chatzeros could join into one Erev chatzeros if they want to. They would be allowed to join because they have the ladder between the two. If they don't want to, they don't have to join. It could count as a...
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.